This episode of the Troxel Podcast is made possible with support from ArchIT. Are you tired of standard IT services that miss the mark? Choose ArchIT for specialized, proactive IT management, BIM support, and robust data security tailored for architects. Whether you're a team of 10 or a growing firm of 50 plus, ArchIT understands the architecture industry and will empower your unique creative vision to enable you to do your best work. Embrace a technology team that enhances, not hinders, your design process. Visit getarchit.com for your free IT assessment and start transforming your firm and your tech experience today. That's getarchit.com. Welcome to the Troxel Podcast. I'm Evan Troxel. In this episode, I welcome my longtime friend, Jared Anderson, to the podcast. Jared is a licensed therapist, although that's not how he became to be my friend. And today we get into the personal side of the profession and discuss the intersection of trauma, creativity, and professional challenges. The conversation springs from his extensive experience working with neurodivergent individuals and those with deep-seated trauma. He was also the lead singer and keyboard player in our band System Kid, which you can find on all of the streaming music services. And you can check the show notes for some links. And you'll hear a little bit more about that time in our lives today when we talk about his history near the beginning of the episode. Today, Jared and I discuss the importance of mental health, understanding one's nervous system, how compartmentalization of past traumas affects present behavior, the challenges of introducing innovative ideas within rigid professional structures, how to effectively communicate and navigate interpersonal dynamics in the workplace, some new technologies being used for trauma recovery, and more. Before the conversation gets started, please help me out. If you are finding value in this podcast, please give it a boost by subscribing wherever you listen. It's totally free to do so, and it really helps me attract sponsors, which is what keeps this podcast sustainable. That's quite literally the business model. If you don't subscribe, this show doesn't work. An alternative is for you to support the show directly by becoming a paid member at trxl.co, where you can get ad-free episodes. Just click the join button in the lower right-hand corner on the website. It's even a justifiable business expense, so think of it that way. And finally, if you'd like to receive an email when new episodes are published with all the links and other information as they come out, you can sign up for that at the website as well. Again, that's trxl.co. This was a really fun conversation with my old friend, and I hope you'll not only find value in it for yourself, but that you'll help add value to the profession by sharing it with your network. And so now, without further ado, I bring you my conversation with Jared Anderson. Well, Jared, welcome to the podcast. It's going to be a fun conversation.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. It's so good to see you.
Okay, so I haven't even asked you for your official bio yet because I know you pretty well, I think. But give us kind of what are you professionally doing right now, and how could it possibly fit into the idea of technology and architecture and what's going on in the world?
Well, this is kind of a weird thing to start with, but relevant to my career. I had a very strange childhood. And immediately when I graduated high school, I went right into working with severely abused children and neglected kids at a group home. And then I did 10 years working with a lot of cool neurodivergent kids and adults. And so deep trauma and neurodivergence are kind of the overlap. And I'm 45 now. So I've been doing 25 years of that. I'm a licensed therapist. I specialize in dissociative disorders, which is sort of the compartmentalization that happens when people have to survive very challenging things, usually at an early age. Because when you're developing, that stuff really imprints on your system. So as I've, developed my career, I kind of also was able to look at the way my nervous system works and being able to see from the inside out what retuning feels like on the inside and what dissociation feels like on the inside, because I can be somewhat dissociative myself, more than the average person. But also, I've sort of been able to be competent on the outside for the most part. Um, and meeting you actually is an interesting and sort of very cool experience because, you know, we're all drawn to people that we think are very cool. And you and I going way back, it was really cool to spend time with you, starting in my 20s and see the way that your brain processes the world. And I've always loved hanging out with people who do design type of things, whether it's fashion design, architecture, interiors, things like that. I remember, can I tell a story about you?
Yeah, yeah. I can
Remember,
edit it out if I have to.
you were dating this really cool woman who was doing an art installation. Remember how she was drawing with pencil, those photorealistic modern homes
Neutra.
on like
Neutra.
a huge.
Yeah, she was fascinated with Neutra.
Yeah. And I remember you and her, she was consulting with you about tiny details where shadows would fall. And she was literally just drawing with pencil on this huge white wall. And I know that you can rotate objects three-dimensionally in your brain in a way that not everybody can. So I have these creatives that come to me, film, television, music, design, even like cancer research and tech and stuff. And so one of the things as we start working is I need to start also defining the way they're experiencing the world through their sensory experience, because some people have hyper realistic. So there's these terms aphantasia and hyperphantasia. And you may have what's described as hyperphantasia, where you get a more clear picture in your brain. So you can Google aphantasia, hyperphantasia, and there's an image of an apple. And there'll be 5 different boxes with different, so that it'll be an empty box, black and white silhouette of an apple, all the way up to one that's more textured with color, and then one that's fully three-dimensional and just like a photo of an apple. So people like Temple Grandin, who's a famous, autistic person or person with autism, can play photos realistically in her brain. Now, when you're in the home growing up and you're getting a sense of what feels safe and cozy, and adults are looking at you and seeing who you are, and you're going, oh, they see me, and I think that's how I feel that I am, and your emotions are going back and forth. That's an example of like a safe upbringing. But if you're growing up in an environment that's really rough and hard to survive, people who are taking in so much information, also gifted people who have high intelligence, they're more likely to feel intense things as traumas. They really imprint much more directly because they're like a hot microphone or like a really sensitive antenna. So working with adults who have that sort of trauma, including these modes of survival that are still sort of set in child places in their nervous system, all of that is what I take in. And this is sort of when you were talking about, because I know you have these amazing podcasts where you talk about design. In my brain, I have a sense of this design factor of how a human experiences the world, and when all of their sort of instrument panel are just really blowing up and which is basically, I get an email, I'm experiencing tons of anxiety and depression, and I have these addictive patterns because I need relief. That's how I help people. And so my job is to sit over here and watch all of what they're telling me and then point to them and say, okay, look over there, look over there. And eventually they start tuning it up so that they have a more accurate read on the world. So it's very abstract. I think I'm getting a little too abstract right up front, but that's a broad overview of what I think about and how I think about it.
Yeah, I'm curious how you do that, because I think everybody who's in my industry, my profession, has to work with other people, right? And when you're working with other people, it's really amazing to understand those people, right? Because people communicate in very different ways. Like you were saying, like I could rotate something in my brain that's 3D and I can understand it from multiple angles. And I work with a lot of people, like on the client side, potentially, who can't do that at all, right? And it's my job to explain things in a way that makes sense to them. And so it would be amazing to have that understanding of people. So I'm curious, like, how do you, I can't imagine it's a short process, right? So there's kind of this relationship building that needs to happen. How do you do that? But also knowing that you're a really intuitive person, right? Like
Yeah.
you've always been able to kind of get somebody's number pretty quickly, and it's like this superpower that you have. And I'm just curious, like, how do you go through that process with somebody? Do you do it through like having them tell you stories? Do you do it through just a series of questions? Is it kind of a formula that you go through, or is it different for everybody? Like once you maybe get
Yeah.
a little bit of insight, okay, now the formula changes. We're going to go down this way and figure it out. I'm just curious how that works.
One real challenge just for me as a human being is keeping it real simple,
Mm-hmm.
because for one thing, even though these are highly functional people at their job, when they start talking to me and they know that vulnerable sides of them are likely to be exposed,
Mm-hmm.
if I just start rambling off a bunch of stuff like I just did with you, they start to dissociate and they forget that they were listening, and they say, I'm sorry, what did you say? So usually I try to just start interacting with them and wait until the end of the session as a way to come back to cognitive thinking. A lot of them have already done therapy. They've already talked about, how much hugs they got in their childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And they have sort of a basic map that it was violent or it was really a cold sort of rigid experience. But they don't, for one thing, dissociation is your body hiding experiences from you. You can't really notice that you're dissociating in the moment. It's a very strange phenomenon. So when you work with a therapist, I can help you notice it and sort of point it out with the person. So, your question, I was going to answer your questions. I was going to start somewhere, and I already started dissociating myself.
That's how it goes.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea of like, how do you start to unpack who somebody actually is, right? Like, and actually figure it out, I guess. Like like you said, you're kind of building a map of who this person is so that you can be effective with them, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now I have my more where I wanted to go.
All right,
Yeah.
cool.
So, I don't know how many people, this is not visual for people. It's just auditory.
It's both, but most people
Okay,
listen.
So people who can't see right now, there's a blanket hanging in a straight line.
Yeah, because I can't tell what it is. I just see a line.
Yeah, it's a Mexican blanket.
Okay.
And so someone comes in and they say, my boss looked at me funny and I've been ruminating on it for the last 3 days.
Okay.
And I just feel like an idiot. And then sometimes I want to murder him. And so I'll say, oh, well, let's work with that. That's cool. And they'll say, yeah, let's go with that. So we'll start in the recent present, which is like 2 days ago. And notice if you play the video in your head, if this is someone that can do that, most people can kind of say, yeah, this conversation started this way. And then he looked at me and he said this thing. So, okay, right there, we'll pause the video. And I can notice that their volume and their voice is already picking up and they're talking quicker and they're starting to use cuss word and this fucking thing. And I know as I'm tracking with them that, they're starting to hit the gas versus the brakes.
Mm-hmm.
They're accelerating.
Mm.
And we're dealing with when they need to defend themselves in a more offense versus defense type of way, because he was comparing down to me and saying, I'm not a good enough employee. And so I'm going to fight back. Now, this line that's behind me, usually the client, starting on, which would be their left, reading left to right. This is 9 month in utero, birth, and then the timeline of their life heading this way to current day, they're 34. And I'm pointing to here on the line, which is, today, and then 3 days ago would just be a little smidge up to this way.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tell them to picture the look on their boss's face, the thing that they said, we boil it down to a sentence of what was happening to me is that I was being devalued. I felt powerless. And so we'll say, well, let's go with that. And because they've already been talking in therapy for 7 years, or because, we have a basic understanding, I'll say, what if you be less thinky about this, less cognitive, intellectual, And notice right now you're picturing that face and the anger. Where are you noticing that physically in your body? And oftentimes anger will have like an up energy that they'll feel physically in their body. It might be in their chest. They might notice that their fists are starting to clench up. And I'll stop and I'll just give some space. Silences are not awkward when we're doing this work, because we're getting out of our head and we're getting into this type of vibe. And I might also say you could scan back as you notice that knot in your chest, scan back in time. And all of a sudden a memory comes up when they were in 6th grade, when their PE teacher, put them down. And what we're doing is we're starting to line up the feeling in my nervous system with the thought in my head of, I want to kill this person. And also noticing 50% of my anger is happening right here at the age of 34. But there's some younger part of me that's a 6th grader that's time traveling. People who have survived a lot of heavy stuff, they really are almost in 6th grade place. They're time traveling. They're both at 34 and the 6th grader is really present. And then what happens is a lot of different events start to overlap. Then I went home from work furious, or I had calmed down a little bit. But then when my girlfriend looked at me a certain way, I took it out on her the same way. And then when my mom called me, it's been 3 days of me just both spacing out, dissociated, and then wanting to kill everybody that I see on the street. So we're starting to just notice in time all of these dissociated events that are not really accurate reads. Yeah, my girlfriend annoyed me a little bit, but it wasn't so much that I wanted to, punch a hole in the wall. And my mom is a tricky one, because my mom was also, didn't protect me when I was in 6th grade, didn't call the school, you know what I mean? So what we're doing is part of surviving trauma is having a cohesive narrative that both lines up in time and it lines up in your body and where you're feeling these sort of abstract feelings and cognitively in front of your brain. And people, when we work together week by week, I send them out in the wild after an appointment. And I say, so this week you're going to notice when the gas starts to rev, and you're going to notice, am I spacing out? Did I leave the office with my, out of my body? And then come back and let me know, how did it go? Did you remember to sort of read the instrument panel? And that's tricky.
Yeah.
We have to do it usually for a while.
It's like everybody has these things going on in their lives, and so does everybody else around them. But it is so hard, I think, for normal people in their day-to-day to remember that. I mean, that's just sounds so basic, and yet it is just so difficult to actually do, to know that everybody's experienced something very different than you, most likely, and yet there's still this kind of general application of we're all the same, right? And on some levels, we are all the same. And on some levels, we are so extremely different, and it's all part of our history that's gotten us where we are. It sounds so simple to even say it out loud, right? But this plays out day after day. It plays out with your supervisor. It plays out with your employees. It plays out with your clients. It plays out with the person who works at the city. It plays out with the contractor who's building the project. Like there's so much there. And like this whole idea of disassociation, and like I can perform, and yet there's so much complexity underneath the surface that has led to this point. And most people, like, there's no time to talk about that. I'm curious from your point of view, like in the busy day to day of what normal life is nowadays, and with all of the distraction and all of the apps and the notifications and everything that's going on that really keeps us from even thinking about that stuff, from really like pulling up the dashboard and looking at what's going on internally. Yeah. Because it's so easy not to nowadays. Like what are the consequences to that? What do you think? How do you think evolution is going at this point where there's so many things pulling at your attention, which is pretty much your most valuable resource, right? In that day to day, that's actually getting in the way of understanding people, and maybe even understanding why we do things in the first place, or why have I chosen to pursue architecture? What was that even for? Because the day to day requirements are so high, just to get things done. And then there's all this distraction layer on top of that.
Yeah. I didn't answer. You were talking about how do I talk to a client that's really dysregulated. And, so all of what I just said does speak to, you can kind of talk to them like you probably already do, which is sort of get on their side and say, oh yeah, I totally see, what you're concerned about. And sort of speak to the emotion as opposed to, get away from the logic of they're acting like an idiot. Logically, they're just expecting magic from me. Mm-hmm. And there's a bit of theater, and it's okay to just more speak to the emotion than the logic. But in the day to day, mindfulness is very important. That's like the main tool, because you have this default mode network, which is, where your attention is. Am I in my head daydreaming, or am I, looking at the trees and the people as I walk down the street, hearing the sounds, feeling the climate on my face, the breeze. And it can be as simple as that. It doesn't have to be set a timer and have an app, bang a gong after I've been sitting here clearing my thoughts. If you can pick a time walking from the car into the grocery store and just be in the parking lot, noticing everything and experiencing it. Notice the sense of neutral when you're just doing that. Mm. That is you tearing the scale so that you can feel your emotions more accurately. The other thing that's really good news is that the younger generation is experiencing the world through their nervous system in more healthy ways. Mm. One clue is the word cringe. Kids are speaking to the one of the instruments on our panel that's the most important is whether I'm comparing up or down in the world, whether I feel like I'm less than people today and I hate myself, or whether I feel pretty good about myself, or even I'm a full narcissist and I just think I'm better than everybody. When kids talk about, ooh, that's cringe, they're openly talking about the emotion of embarrassment and shame. And they're also talking about where it sits in your body. Because when you cringe, you go, ugh. Yeah. You get a sort of nauseous feeling of like, oh, I'm so embarrassed that I said something cheesy right now. That was cringe. So it's all over TikTok. There's tons of examples of where kids are noticing their emotional health, and they're talking about what I just talked about, my various speeches about where things are in the nervous system or in the amygdala in the brain. There's just tons of videos about that on Instagram and TikTok. And what's strange is that our generation, we're that sort of micro generation. What are we at? We're at the end of Gen X. Is that
you might be more at the end of it than I am, but yeah.
Well, our parents are the boomers,
right?
And boomers see the world more concretely. Their parents really didn't sit and feel emotions with them,
right? And
so they almost don't have a belief in feeling like a vibe in your body. It's kind of tricky sometimes to work with those clients because there's a disconnect between what we can sense in our gut. We have tons of nerve endings all through our vagus nerve and our face, down our neck, into every single organ in our body. And we're starting to discover that it also extends out into our fascia, which is just the whole body. And so you can break your wrist as a kid and then be in therapy talking about an intense emotion, and all of a sudden you'll get a sharp pain in your wrist. Mm-hmm. Because the fascia, there's some energy stuck in there. Electrical impulses, we're still figuring out how that works. And boomers oftentimes don't believe that. They just think it's woo-woo. Mm-hmm. And, I don't have time in a 55 minute session to sort of lecture. And my knowledge is sort of limited by what I've read and also what we even have in research. But we're finding that is very true. And unfortunately, one thing that really gets me heated, the standards for what they teach therapists are so antiquated. They don't, I heard that this is a podcast about CEUs. I basically had to do a graduate level of study for 4 or 5 years and rack up tons of CE. It's not a competition, but I have tons of CE.
You have an unhealthy relationship with them. So.
Just somatic experience is 3 years and probably $15,000.
Jeez.
All told, because you have to do all kinds of supervision hours and go to in person. Anyway, So yeah, the new generation, they're really starting to figure it out. That, when you listen to pop music, there's tons of references to people's therapists and the work that they're doing. And you're starting to hear in like people who make culture, like in their memoirs, in their autobiographies, I hear cues that they're working with therapists who are doing parts work with them, which is structural dissociation. Because usually great creators, their brains do work in these quirky ways. They are gifted and they are very traumatized. Usually they were sort of dissociating from a very difficult upbringing, and their brain was able to go into these beautiful places. And then they made music that really transcended. And so when they go to therapy and they realize, like, my trauma is starting to make it difficult for me to keep my cool on a film set. And then they start to learn some of the processes of sort of tuning up their nervous system and working with these developmental child things. So it's cool because it's coming out in the art as well. Some of these television shows that are showing the story out of time, or the same character is sort of telling its story from like the angry fighter version of them, the sad child version of them. It's amazing. I love it because people can almost heal a little bit vicariously through just watching their stories on TV.
Yeah.
And I love the way that your field, people who do these shit like design that affects the physical world, you can walk into a building and feel a sense of safety, feel a sense of like, oh, here's a little moment where I can sit over here and the light is a certain way, and there's chairs that bring people together. There's different smells, and because the world is so digital, like you're referencing, people are going to conventions, they're going to in-person experiences. So yeah, I find it thrilling.
I love how you kind of weaved in this storytelling side of things for people. Like we had a text message conversation the other day where I sent you an interview on Rick Beato's YouTube channel, which I probably have referenced on this podcast before because it's been impactful. I mean, and maybe real quick, I would love for you maybe to tell a little bit of story of why we know each other well, and because we played music together for a few years, right? And we made music, and I think even that totally ties into all the things you're talking about, kind of what we were doing there. But this idea of using this disassociative coping mechanism that people have to go somewhere else and make something really interesting. I mean, that to me, like what you're describing there in my terms is architecture versus buildings. Like you're actually talking about things that are special in different ways than what people normally experience when they just go into any old building, especially like a big box. So, most people spend most of their time in just what I would just call buildings, but not architecture. And you go somewhere special or someplace that makes you feel special because somebody had an intention to design a space that could take you to a different place, for example. I mean, that was my first experience in architecture was like noticing that about a place that could do that to me or for me. And most buildings aren't architecture, right? It's a small percentage of the overall, but it has the power to do that. But so do so many other forms, like you're talking about movies, television, music, right? Painting. There's so many other ways in which creatives can kind of take you to another place. It doesn't have to be a good place. It could just be another place, but it's one of those things where it's like you notice something about it that maybe takes you out of your current moment of busy to just say, oh wow, like there's something different or special here. But maybe before we get to that part of it and what you're noticing there, like that's really amazing, it's like maybe just tell the story of System Kid for a moment.
Yeah, well, you and I both grew up in the church, and we ended up in this sort of DIY church that we were,
right.
Just sort of wrapped up in our late teens, 20s.
Right.
And we were, we grew up in this very sad suburb where it was a lack of beautiful colors and design. And being able to set something up in a school gymnasium as creatives, I think we would kind of go into a flow state and really just create music and hang build sets and stages and things for to get us out of suburbia.
Yeah.
And then I had been working in the group home, and we started this band, and it was so cool because not to butter us up, but we were lucky to find good players.
Yeah.
The four of us, all of us were pretty proficient at what we did, and we all have a bit of a design mind. Bart, the drummer, really can drum from a very sort of evocative place, as Ray also makes really ambient, amazing, and like sometimes aggressive sounds. And you're incredible because you the bass, when I'm talking with people about their nervous systems, I'll ask particular musicians, because they're starting to learn the difference between when they get in their head and get cognitive and very rational, concrete. And I'll say, you're starting to notice the vibe in your gut of where the pain is sitting in your body. If you were looking at a software, at a recording software, at Pro Tools or whatever, what track would that vibe be? And they usually say the bass. It's the bass guitar, because it has so much effect over the sound of a song from behind, from within. And it's literally the bass, which is important in design. So we would make this music, and the four of us would kind of go into these flow states in the garage, writing and playing and just jamming. And then we would start saying, well, what would the logo and the t-shirt look like? What would the lighting and the performance look like? And we got to go into LA and go into these clubs and the Roosevelt Hotel and experience the ambiance of playing at, the Viper Room versus the Roosevelt. And whenever we started thinking visually, you would come back the next day with a deliverable.
Right.
You could literally just design it 3D. It would print it on the t-shirt already. It would be in the mail, the shipment of CD jewel cases.
I
or
could
whatever.
execute. Yeah.
You are an executor. Yeah. You do destroy in that particular way. And so, we were all dissociating together, you could say, in a really amazing way. It's kind of like a group dissociation. And isn't that religion? But let's not go there. So, does that speak to how we?
Yeah, and the name of the band, I think, is also associative
Kid,
to what like you were doing more than I think anybody else, right? But it was very much pulling, and that kind of worked its way into the music for sure, right? Like that was where a lot of it started.
Well, and for the listener, a system kid is a child that has grown up and taken from their family and grown up in the sort of system of the city sort of services. And I was always a little bit on the, I don't know what the word is, but because I'm not a system kid. So looking back, there's a little bit of sort of appropriation, but it speaks to being dissociated, and it's still in the work that I do, because, people with trauma dissociate, and kids who are literally dissociated from their families. And I think the four of us, we did sort of deal with our emotional lives in the music, and we talked about it because we were close. And so, it was kind of nice to be doing, musical therapy, maybe of sorts, or just creative stuff.
Yeah, totally. I feel like I'm actually getting back to a point in my life where I'm doing that again, right? Like right now, actually, which is really cool to have this conversation with you now, because that was like almost 20 years ago that we did that, right? It was, so it's like this new feeling that, but I've had it before, right? It just feels new because it's been some time since that's happened. But, it's really incredible to kind of hear you tell that story, because I would never have told the story like you just did. Like, I don't know what words would have come out, but they wouldn't have been those. And to get your perspective of kind of how all that happened it's fun to listen to. So I'll put a link to it in the show notes, because people can actually listen to the music if they want to hear it, to see what we're talking about here. But System Kid's the name of the band. You can find it on the streaming services for the songs that we actually put out there. There were quite a few more that we recorded but never put out, but didn't professionally record them, just kind of garage band type recordings.
Yeah, we were just trying to figure it out.
But there was, yeah. And it was such an interesting process. I remember there was a point in my life where if you would have asked me what I was going to do, even though I had already gone to architecture school and done, it would have been music. You know, it was that strong of a pull. Yeah, and I know it's the same for you too. And I'm actually shocked that you're not doing it more, but it sounds like you're finding your place in the world with what you're doing. And I'm curious from like the standpoint of there's kind of two sides to the same coin in this conversation. There's the feelings that we have, and there's the analysis, the internal analysis that you're talking about, and then there's like the dealing with other people's side of it, right? Which is how do we figure this out about other people? Are there tools that people can use like for themselves, but also when they're sitting in conversations, in difficult conversations at work? You know, I think everybody who listens to this podcast knows exactly what I'm talking about when they're kind of on the bleeding edge of technology in architecture. And, you know, to go back to the boomers that you were talking about, who are still in charge at most firms, who just don't get it or don't and have kind of those thoughts and feelings of like just do the work. Like that's a very strong push in architecture because of where architecture has been. For how like everybody needs to experience. There's an assumption that you're going to experience the profession the same way that they did. And it's not the case. Like you're talking about what's showing up in TikToks and Instagram videos nowadays. Like that's what's showing up in firms too, right? That these people are bringing this new awareness to the profession of architecture. And there's also generations in architecture who don't want to hear about it, right? They think it's woo woo, right? To go back to your words, right? And it's like, what do you mean? Just do your work, like just show up, just work more. And so as people are experiencing this, who are probably on the younger side of the 4 or 5 generations that are in that same office today, and not being able to talk the language or have the understanding with the older generations who are the ones paying the paychecks and have built the relationships with the clients and kind of the workflows that need to happen in an office. Like how do you deal with, like, are there tools to deal with and to come to a better resolution amongst these multi-generational firms and working with clients?
Can you give me a scenario?
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the scenario is a lot of people who are in this small niche of architecture, who are really technologically advanced, avant-garde, like they're bleeding edge. They want to do things better. They want to get rid of the mundane work through automation and tooling, right? So that we can do incredible design work because the timelines are short and the budgets are small. And previously the answer was like, just work harder and work more, right? And you'll get paid the same. You know, there's no such thing as overtime. There's no, like, all-nighters were typical. That's changing, but it's changing so slowly. And technology adoption is really difficult in these firms that have been doing the things that they've always done, right? So a lot of times these people are beating up against, you know, a hard ceiling of like, no, we're going to continue to do it the way that we've always done it. And so how do you bring these new ideas, these new like introspective understandings, understanding more, a bigger range of emotion when you're dealing with people who run the firms who don't?
Yeah. It's tricky because the first thing is we want to be careful not to run the risk of condescension, of just going, how can I sort of fool this old geezer into getting what I want? Because the tricky thing is that you do sometimes, we need to speak the language that they speak, even though our values are not aligning. And so there is a little bit of, you know, I just, you know, start out by just sort of checking that I'm not being cynical when I go into talking to somebody. The next thing is keeping in mind, compare up and compare down, which is sort of the shame spectrum. and leading with showing respect to the person. I know you want the best for this company, and I've noticed that you really care about what we put out there. And so I thought you might be interested in this approach that I just found out. And that's tricky because, unfortunately, if there is someone that's older and maybe just you could just get a sense of rigidity in the way that they see the world. Working with rigidity is just tricky.
Yeah.
There's not often, it's a bummer also that you have to be so flexible and, bend yourself into a Gumby knot just to get them to understand that there are new and smarter and more efficient ways of doing things, that sometimes actually working a little bit less is going to increase the outcome, because human beings, our brains do need some time to just sort of space out and let the files sort so that we can go back in and do this really intricate, sophisticated sort of design work. So this is like, this is sort of a designer who's in a firm, and there's a leadership structure where they're trying to pitch ideas to the leadership that just want to do things the old way. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that happens a lot, right? But I don't think that's specific to this profession either, right? There's kind of this that rigid structure is in a lot of creative fields where people go in with this passion for, they come out of school, they want to do things. I don't want to just say like they want to do things differently,
okay,
but they have a different point of view than maybe previous generations have, and the structure doesn't allow for that as easily as they would hope. And then they kind of retreat and maybe even go outside of the profession because they just keep hitting these ceilings.
So the human brain does naturally, it's designed or it's evolved to make stories and to make logic out of things. And the main construct is through relationships, personalities. That's sort of how we survived, is by collectively working together. It's sort of where evolution went, is sort of individual creatures like reptiles, warm-blooded animals started to sort of collaborate a little bit more. And then humans were able to take things to another level with collaborating. And what I'm getting at is, me as a designer or someone young who wants to bring something special to the design and to the career, I guess. Before I go into the office and deal with this person, I want to deal with the parts of my emotion and the parts of my personality, and kind of ask, when I go in there and talk to this person with power, what is my relationship with power? In what ways were teachers and principals, policemen, parents, adults intimidating to me? Did I feel misunderstood by them? Did I feel like I never had control in those situations or agency? And so in the car on the way in, it's okay to talk to yourself a little bit and say, hey, parts of you that are afraid of this boss, that are just so frustrated with how they won't let me move, feel that when you're driving. And anytime, this is a bit of a bird walk, but this is actually very concrete. Anytime you're doing something that's bilateral, anytime the left side and the right side of your body are going back and forth, back and forth. This is when these little micro movements that we do on the steering wheel, just adjusting the car, going a little bit this way, a little bit that way. That's happening subconsciously. We're not usually consciously paying attention. We're not consciously paying attention to scanning from the pasta on the left side of the grocery store aisle to the paper towels. But whenever we're walking, showering, driving, you're more likely to zone out.
Autopilot.
And all these autopilot states that are doing bilateral stuff are sorting files, sort of. And you're more likely to have a little bit of emotion, maybe some inspiration. That's when you have your best ideas, is on a walk. And so keep your eye on the road. Make sure that you're like sort of staying present, and then also going in and staying present at the same time. And you might feel a little bit of that frustration, and you might feel yourself starting to space out a little bit, because I'm about to go in and have a hard conversation about, I need more budget for this project. I really think we should use this material that's going to be striking when humans walk into this place. and say, like, if there's get a sense of how old that feels. It's like, yeah, I feel like I'm being treated like a furious teenager or just like a child. I want all y'all to sort of sit back and just be cozy playing your video games or whatever, and just go in there in your full adult form as much as possible. Or you can also bring in your friends, your, loving grandparents and sometimes there's this Maya Angelou clip on Instagram that I've seen recently where she says, invite your ancestors. I know these things sound very woo woo, but believe it, because we are very suggestible even to ourselves. That's why Buddhism and some of these ancient sort of religious or spiritual or mindful sort of approaches, even Freud, differentiate between the self, that's witnessing, and some other part that's experiencing, that's reactive. And so when we're doing, therapy, we're trying to start to be self-led, which is the most adult me that's talking to you right now on this, video call. And I noticed you nodding that I just said something. And so you and I are confirming that we're here in the now. But when I was telling you the story about us in the garage, I was getting a little bit of tingles because it was so exciting. And I was kind of like back there and I lost you here in the moment. And so we wanted to be able to, in the moment, be able to, just like I said before, sort of like checking the various camera angles, and sort of, go in and say, I'm about to walk in this office. Let me notice if I start to space out when I'm trying to make my point. Let me notice if my throat gets a little caught up. And oftentimes what you want to do is slow down and just stop for a second. You might ask to just run to the restroom and come back. Go in the restroom, breathe for a second, look in the mirror, look at the paper towels, smell the restroom. When you get in your sensory stuff, you start to come back to the building. And then you can kind of regroup and say, okay, what's important is that I go in there and remember he's thinking about budgets and about, bottom line stuff. So I want to speak to what he wants without being too condescending to him. But also sometimes there does take a little bit of theater and just, getting on their side and saying, yeah, I know we want to do something really great. I know that you've always saw this company as whatever. And so, yeah, I guess there's a little bit of fluffing.
I think part of it is learning what the game is so that you can play the game the most effectively.
It's a game,
right?
Yeah.
And there's these there's these characters in the game, and you have to learn enough so that you said it earlier, like you have to learn how to speak their language. And I feel as a Gen Xer, like a lot of times that was the Gen Xer's job was to bridge the gap between the older generations and the younger generations, because on some level you can speak enough of both languages to actually translate for both of them, right? But
to really make things happen, you have to be authentic, though. You can't be false. So one thing is to listen to them and sort of figure out where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And if you can get a little bit of personal while maintaining professional, like get a little bit of the human. There's this thing called ventral vagal state, which is a combination of both feeling rested and sort of, grounded, while also feeling energized and motivated. And then also being with a person. So when you and I are talking shop about music and all that stuff, we're sort of in a ventral vagal back and forth type of state. So it's a casual type of thing. When you're in the office with the client or the boss and you notice the weather. Did it get thick did the air get thick in here? Did it get real sort of quiet and almost like, feeding time at the savannah? Notice that, because we're starting to get into fight mode and we're dropping out of that casual state. And that it helps to go and work on the baseline, which is sort of a strange type of work to do. It's sort of the direction that therapy is going. But, anyway, sorry, I cut you off. But.
No, what this also makes me think about is kind of this idea at the end of these interactions to ask yourself for a summary of it and actually just write those things down. What did you notice? Because there's so many times where we're just on to the next thing, right? And I think especially in the world we live in, there is always the next thing, and it's right there waiting for this thing to end so that we can go and do the next thing, right? And there's not a lot of time spent just, okay, let's do a debrief. And if it's just a debrief with yourself, that's fine. If it's a debrief with the other people on your team that were doing that, what did you notice? What did you notice? How did they take that? And and you're just writing it down just to notice it and really kind of go back, and because the next time it's not going to be too different from that, right? And so what can you do then to adjust for what you just learned and do it better the next time, I think is a huge deal, right? Like that's something that most people aren't taking the time to do. I don't know how many people like journal out there, right? But those are the kinds of things where it's just ask yourself for a summary or ask your teammates for a summary at the end, and something that you write down or you think will trigger something else, and you will get a pretty decent summary at the end that you could then learn from and improve on the next time you go do something similar.
That's a fantastic point. We say, like, what do we, when in therapy session, in a therapy session, the amount of times that I say, what are you noticing now? It's probably the most used word, because sort of passive noticing or active noticing, I guess, it helps to associate, the opposite of dissociate. And what you're talking about doing it collectively is really cool. What did you notice? And what did you notice? And what did I notice? We're now sort of pooling together a collective type of thing, which is a really special, it's a special quality of consciousness. Like there's a study of consciousness. I have the book over here. It's The Strange Order of Things. It's sort of a intense read. You almost want to take it in chunks because, but there's a leading scholar at USC who writes about how consciousness works scientifically, how it works, in the course of evolution. Even the word cultures, he sort of connects how cultures and bacteria, how bacteria sense their little world and where's the food and how do I reproduce. There's a parallel with how human culture is our collective noticing, like what you're talking about in a mini way after a meeting, but in a macro way around Marvel or Taylor Swift, is sort of like we're pooling our values and the direction that we're moving. Like when we talk about TikTok. So in a design group, putting that on paper, you do want to keep something concrete, so that you have a map of what you're doing. Just like what's the guy who created the what I have it right there. Let me just grab it. Sometimes I forget the name of this. He's the record producer who worked with David Bowie. Oblique Strategies. That in a creative, you want a frame, you want rules, so that you have at least some parameter to then go crazy and just create in a creative way. Yeah. So, these oblique strategy cards.
I've heard of that. Yeah. There's different versions of that. There's one that
Brian Eno.
Yeah. Eno has a set. There's some famous architects like the Eames have a set, I think. And then there's like the IDEO. There's a D school at Stanford, and IDEO is a design firm that's like just a design firm. They'll do anything, and they use these kind of strategy cards to kind of kick off conversations and just see where they go. Yeah. And it's just like
David Byrne has something to do with it too, maybe.
I think that's another one. Yeah.
Spiritually, he does, doesn't he?
Right. But this idea of that's a very architectural idea too, architectural training, which is like you basically define a language or a set of rules for your project, and then you find ways in which you break them, right? Because you don't have to follow the rules that you made, but the rules help you as kind of guiding principles to go through and understand, like, what is the map of this project from a very guiding principles level, and then where do you very decisively decide to break those rules, right, to achieve something important, for example, Right. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. A lot of architects are trained that way. But I think a lot of times we forget that we were trained like that. And it's good to go back and think about those kind of foundational things in architectural training that make us a little bit different than a lot of other people out there when it comes to problem solving. So, yeah.
Yeah. I have my scaffolding is I have to know the basic goal of every age level of a human developing, like because fetuses are very impacted by what mother was feeling. And then when you're born in the first year, the 5th year, the 12th year are some important sort of milestones. So I'll be sitting talking to an adult who may be in their 50s. And we'll start off with the problem that is a very 50-something-year-old problem on a, let's say, like a film set. And then the feeling and the emotion may actually be pre-verbal.
Wow.
And so it's weird. Halfway through the session, once they get into their nervous system, I may be talking to this person in their 50s like a baby. Like very soft, gentle. Oh, yeah, not a lot of language. Yeah. Oh, ouch, it's rough. Which would creep a lot of people out. Before you go through puberty, or maybe around the age of 8, earnestness, like Mr. Rogers vibes, is people hate that. It's so cheesy and so whatever. But the weird thing is that I have this design scaffolding in my head, and because it is real and it's true that people can very much associate that way. That's sort of proof that this 50-year-old would never let me talk to them that way. But when they were that age, never got it. And right now through a Zoom call, they'll get it. It's a very strange type of thing, but I can't be jumping around from like baby to teenager. It will really throw the person off and they'll hate it and they'll leave and never come back. So I have to sort of go into a session knowing based on what we did, where we're going on the map. And after the session, it's same thing. Like you said, I have to write down what I noticed, because I can't always be writing while I'm working with them real time. Right. And I do wish I could do it more collaboratively. I am jealous that you get to work in teams, like physical design, and that your day is not about dealing with suffering. Or maybe it is. I do tend to hang out with architects, and there is a level of suffering that y'all.
For sure. So something that you said there just makes me want to ask about kind of the timeline of a session. And I think that this applies to any interaction that you have with people. It could be a meeting, it could be formal, it could be informal, right? But there's always kind of this initial state of the whole idea of what an icebreaker is for, right? Is to get to the point where we can actually have a conversation. And you talked about like at the point in the session where you get into the nervous system, right? And there's like this higher level of comfort to just have the conversation, but this goes for meetings too, right? And so do you have any tips or tools that you use to kind of try to get to that state? Because this also applies to creativity and flow state and things like that, where it's like it doesn't just show up when you want it to. Like you have to go through maybe a series of steps, and people probably know themselves what works for them to get into these states when they need to. Like a video presentation that I think of when I'm talking about this kind of thing is John Cleese has a great video on YouTube, a much younger John Cleese, where he talks about creativity and management and how you kind of need to go into one, but then you need to go out of that state to get into this other one and think about completely different things. And you really shouldn't try to mesh them together. A lot of times I feel like in a creative field like architecture, there's kind of this overwhelming feeling of we need efficiency, we need the bottom line, and then that's in total conflict with the creative process a lot of times, right? And so you need both. Like the business wouldn't be there without both of them, but to mesh them too much actually messes with the process in a very detrimental way. Not too different from a conversation. Like how do you get to the point where you can actually get to people being open and comfortable and more relationship versus transactional? Do you have any tips or tools in that kind of from your practice that might apply to what we're talking, like my profession?
Yeah, I don't invite them to sort of jump right into the problem.
Yeah.
We say hello and we'll maybe check, what's the energy like? I'm curious what you were doing right before this. And maybe you can notice, do you still feel the intensity? It could be pleasant or unpleasant, the intensity. Maybe they're really pumped on something that they're making. And then we'll notice that coming in. Okay. And now we're transitioning to this thing about how we feel, and call it hugonomics sometimes. And once we're doing the work that we do in a therapy session, it's circles. So we're noticing the human body will sort of normally circle up a little bit into energy and then sort of down. They'll start to slump and yawn and get spacey if we're working on something a little more intense. And we titrate. We can't just jump into something that's really angering or depressing and get stuck there. I need to know that week by week, if we're going to go into the dark cave, that before we go in there, that they have the ability to come out and get back to work and be productive, which is tricky because these are oftentimes pretty intense, sophisticated people doing big work. And so we have to do a lot of noticing, am I back or am I activated? And go back and forth, titrating back and forth. That's also what helps work out the kinks. Naturally noticing the change into something a little bit more intense, and then we could orient back to the room and just say, where does my curiosity go? Does it go visual? Oh, there's my plant. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, what did that breath feel like when I noticed you saw your plant and you took a breath? And when you look at I have this climbing plant all over this corner of my office. And I just noticed when I'm talking to you, I noticed you a little bit more than being in my head thinking about what I'm about to say. I noticed my chest kind of settle and my stomach felt a little bit more pleasant. My shoulders kind of came down. Okay. So I'm transitioning from what I want to say, is it going to be good enough for the podcast, to, oh, I'm hanging out with E and I love this plant. And so we do that. And the nice thing is in the middle of a session, oftentimes something will release. Maybe we've been working on it for several weeks, but they'll notice, oh, this thing that is really rooted in something that happened in sixth grade. I'm not in sixth grade anymore. My body knows that as well. And so when I go in and that thing is annoying, it's only 50% annoying. It's not 100% annoying. And then I can go home and see my partner. And he didn't really piss me off because it has nothing to do with my boss. Because also at the end of the workday, I really paid attention to the transition of okay, I'm going to sort of let some of this fall off when I walk from the office into the car. And then a lot of times we really want to do nice, kind, cozy things for our sensory. Is it a podcast drive? Is it a roll down the windows drive? Is it music? Lighting incense or putting a scent in the house. Really noticing that I really want to smell some delicious Indian food tonight. And I need to put some music on and notice the change. When I put the music on, oh, that really changed the vibe in here collectively. We do kind of need to do those things for ourselves. Sometimes we get dissociated from noticing that I can get up and go to the bathroom. I've been sitting here having to go to the bathroom and I forgot to let myself do that. And a lot of times that's rooted in some other stuff of well, am I worth even taking care of myself? But my job is to point and say, notice this, notice that, notice this. And hopefully we start to do that. And it really does improve productivity because we're noticing what's wrong about my state right now that's not allowing me to go into that creative flow state. I need to do a little, doing witchcraft or religion. Well, let me not get into the philosophies of all that stuff because there are things we also just don't know about the world. When you look at quantum physics and stuff, the universe and God, I'm not devaluing that information, but a ritual, which is sort of the shared thing, human beings and ritual can be really important to transition us so that our nervous system knows I was doing that and now I'm doing this. And whether it's going from creative to more, accounting and that type of stuff, or the other way around, we can kind of get a sense of how we transition ourselves with a little bit of love and kindness, not to be cheesy, but yeah. Also,
I'm curious what the it sounds like everybody's got some amount of this structural disassociation, right? And this compartmentalization of past traumas, and I'm just curious, what the value is in your eyes of working through that stuff, because you're doing this for a reason, right? And everybody has these things, and I think a lot of times we feel like I'm not going to deal with that. There's not any value in dealing with that because I have enough in front of me right now that I need to worry about, right? And so when it comes to what are the benefits of going through this process and shedding those things that come up, and you're like, oh, that doesn't serve me anymore. I don't need to deal with that anymore, even though you've maybe unconsciously been dealing with it for decades at that point.
It is a broad spectrum. So for people who did get enough hugs in their childhood, for the most part, particularly if you can remember just a good deal of things from your childhood, we lose a ton of memory. You're not expected to remember everything. And some people have superior autobiographical memory, but some people their childhood's a total blur, and that's a bit of a red flag. And so if you know that you're relatively well regulated and not super reactive in the world, then your sense of like, it could just be your inner child. It can just be being kind to the sensitive part of you and the vulnerable part of you, and just keep it, one younger you, and then just the you in the present eyewitnesses. I am feeling a little sad today, or just a little touchy today. Or I don't really feel good in these clothes today. But for people who don't know what it's like, those of us who have survived much more complicated things, including if it was a very rigid, cold experience as a child. And it's hard for those people because they can't point and say I was beaten or sexually abused. But if your parents were very rigid, it was a very Midwestern or a super like rigidly religious type of experience, there can be some pretty intense, even dissociation, but certainly like attachment injuries, which is about how you feel love and how you're seen or see other people. And so that's when you're going to have parts of you that have to defend you in opposing ways. The parts that really want to go toward the person you love, and the parts that run away from them at the same time. Now you really have to dissociate because you need to survive in two different ways. And those are both very sophisticated ways of surviving. And that's when you might want to go talk to somebody who can work in these sort of, if you get the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and you skip to the end, there's a list of sort of forward moving therapies, and there are technologies like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, that can be really cool for like where you experience like unsafe things in your brain. There's vagus nerve stimulation. They can implant for some people that have pretty severe depression, something in your vagus nerve, which is the main nerve that tells you what emotions are coming from your body down to your gut. There's EMDR, although be careful with EMDR for people who have severe trauma. It's a blunt tool. EMDR is that bilateral back and forth stuff in a therapy session. And some people will go get trained in it, and then they'll just start doing it, and then people will dissociate and get super activated. But anyway, go get that book. And like one thing you'll look for if you have somebody in your life that you love, but oftentimes people who are very charismatic, very gifted and creative, and had a difficult childhood can be both so charismatic and also very reactive. They feel things so strong, like everything is just a raw nerve, up and down. And so that may be someone who has structural dissociation, but you wouldn't know it usually unless you realize, well, I really am a different me when this happens, and then I'm a different me when this happens. And there's a lot of like antiquated diagnoses, and people, this is a bit controversial. Some people are going to have a problem with me saying this, but trauma specialists look at the DSM, which is sort of the insurance manual of psychological problems, and something like personality disorders, like borderline personality. Trauma therapists don't hold too tight to that stuff. They see that as someone who has different parts of themselves that's rooted in their nervous system, the parts that had to fight, the parts that had to shut down, the parts that had to go into like a play dead mode, which is what depression essentially is. And so I went way off the path of what you just asked me. I get real excited and I just start, if you can't tell.
Me too.
I go into like nerd town with my own stuff, but yeah.
It is interesting to think about how much of the internal, like how much value that, so you're either clearing through the trauma kind of stuff so that you can be a better you, right, at your job or in your personal life, but also like the things that you can actually bring that maybe you don't need to clear, but you need to remember who you are and why you're a certain way, can add so much richness to whatever it is that you do. And to me, like that, I think that when I think about the benefits of like doing this exploration, whether it's personal exploration or trying to figure out the people that you have to deal with, what are the ways I can communicate? How can I relate to them in this moment? Can add a lot of richness to it. And to me, like the real value is just the the more valuable interactions we can have with people by kind of doing this work on ourselves, but also trying to figure out other people.
For the people, particularly these creative, charismatic, neurodivergent type of brains that can dissociate in sometimes lovely ways, because you learn to enjoy it almost, because you can control it a little bit more and sort of watch the instrument panel as it's happening, which you're dissociating into your design work when you're sitting down, you sort of lose time.
Mm-hmm.
For the parts of you that are feeling things really strongly and maybe really like wrapped up in this dynamic with your boss or someone, when you notice these different parts of you that want to fight or shut down, what we'll do is we'll start to talk to them like inner children, and people will start to naturally design this inner space where those parts of themselves live. That, well, I'll tell you, mine is, I have this sense of it's kind of like there's this Japanese concept of mecha, which is like a huge robot that you can, it's like a vehicle as well, like Voltron.
Right.
And so it's a time machine. It's also like it can travel through time, and it's where like her parts of me hang out. And it has a lot of senses of who I love music. I love Prince. So part of it's purple. The design on the outside is like metallic blue with purple elements. And my clients will have this magic tree house where once they start to go there, they start to calm down in the session and notice their nervous system. And people who have been through terrible, terrible things and actually have different, like multiple personalities or dissociative identity disorder. I've worked with people who have spreadsheets and have designed ways in which their parts are organized beautifully in like, can't be too specific, but let's say they're different countries around like a new planet. And so the angry parts of me can live in this island. And, people with hyperphantasia, they can kind of do this, like when they can dissociate when they're at the dentist and they're getting a root canal. They can just go into their little place and do amazing things and know that they're actively dissociating. And it helps them when they're looking at a really stressful week at work. I'll say, why don't you take these parts of you that are nervous about these upcoming things and why don't you go through the flight plan? What's going to happen? And so they say on Monday, this is going to happen. On a Wednesday, we have to get in front of a group of people and talk. And they'll notice all these parts kind of settle into their little beanbag chairs and their little compartments, kind of like in their little Star Trek spaceship. And again, it may sound really woo-woo to people, but, actually the opportunity to say this to a group of designers is kind of important, because people are right now building apps to organize different survival parts. There are concepts like the 5 survival imperatives are attach, shame, fear, flight, and fight, which are sort of nervous system states. And like I told you about, there also, you have to understand sort of like the developmental stages and stuff. And so when someone designs an app where you can sort of map what's going on in your world with your relationships and check in with like, I got really activated in a fight type of way. VR is going to be really important for this, because people with aphantasia who don't have an inner like view of, can't see things in their head, they can put on a VR headset and sort of go into these calming places or be able to destroy something, and so that they can finally basically get back at their stepmom or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it helps the nervous system complete actions. So you're no longer that activated or triggered moving forward. And the nice thing is that it has to have human elements. We can never eliminate humans from this equation, but just having Zoom and being able to connect with other humans, therapists, things like that, sort of brings that in to where there could be technology and humans helping each other. Mm-hmm. And if you could actually design like your inner spaceship on a phone or in a through AI or something, and then know today this happened, I'm going to this part of me. Being able to concretize things is the realm of design professionals. Yeah. People who make things concrete. Right. So you can cut out some of the other bullshit and just put that in there, because that's sort of
interesting.
My heart's plea.
Yeah, that's cool.
And give me a cut. Please consult with me. I'd like a percentage.
Oh man, this has been a fun conversation, and I've learned a lot today. I feel like I'm also learning this stuff in my life, right? And to kind of hear the science behind it from your perspective in a very different field, and through the experiences that you're having working with clients through these traumas and through all of these things, it's an incredible resource for me to be able to ask you these questions, but also to give this conversation to a larger audience. And so I appreciate you doing this.
Well, you've been an incredible resource for me, both in the way that your brain works and also because you're a calm, safe person, which is sort of speaks to what we do. It's meeting people that are chill and fun to hang out with and smart. So, yeah, I love you. You're the best.
Thanks. Love you too. Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to our members this week. Find out how you can become a member at trxl.co. And I'll talk to you again next week.